Okay, it is about 10:05, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, welcome to the meeting today. My name is Anargia, and I will be one of your hosts for today's meeting. Um, I am from FTC Team 23270 Sounderbots, a community team FTC team based in Sammamish, Washington. In our third year of FTC and seventh year of FIRST Robotics, our journey has been driven by one core mission: to ignite passion for STEM and robotics in our next generation of engineers. Over the years, we have helped launch and mentor numerous school and community robotics teams. Thanks to the incredible enthusiasm of students, parents, and educators, our data shows a steady rise in STEM interest year after year, a trend that inspires us to keep pushing forward. Also heard from many teams that connecting with experts remains a challenge. That's why we're here today, to bridge that gap and support the community in every way we can. A heartfelt thank you to you, Mr. Jensen and Mr. Mofidi, for generously sharing their time and expertise with us. Your presence means a lot, and your insights will ripple through the community. Together, let's keep building, mentoring, and inspiring. The future STEM is bright, and we're proud to be a part of it. Before we get started, I have a couple of house rules for all of you guys in the meeting. We'd like you guys to please stay on mute throughout the call to respect our presenters and their presentation. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the meeting. So if you have any questions throughout the meeting, please put them in the chat and we will compile all of them and have a question and answer session at the end of the meeting. If you have any personalized questions related to your own innovation project, um, please send them to either Coach Chandra, who is in the meeting labeled as Sounderbots, or Coach Reshmi. They can direct you guys to having a conversation with one of our presenters today. With that out of the way, I'm gonna start by introducing our presenters. We have Sam Jensen, a PhD student studying archaeology at the University of Oklahoma. He studies the social organizations of the Casas Grandes cultures of Chihuahua, Mexico. And we have Ethan Mofidi, an archaeologist and PhD student at the University of Oklahoma, specializing in Southeast and Great Plains of the US. His research focuses on hunter-gatherers, environmental change, and human-environment interactions, with current work on the 6,000 to 5,500-year-old Half Creek horizon. Please welcome them, and you guys can get started whenever you're ready.
As I say, thanks so much, Anarga. Today we've prepared just like a short presentation to sort of explain what archaeology is, what some of the things Ethan and I do are, as well as sort of introduce you to some of the materials that archaeologists work with. Something that's really cool about archaeology is that it's a really broad discipline, meaning it incorporates lots of STEM elements as well as many of the arts, humanities, and social sciences as well. So there really is lots of ground for students like you guys to be able to participate in the archaeological process and design solutions for some of the issues that we have in archaeology. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to show our presentation. As I say, are you guys able to see that all right? Okay,
Yeah, we can see
perfect.
your screen.
Yes.
So Ethan's going to help me. Feel free to jump in anytime, Ethan. But we wanted to start off just explaining, what archaeology is. So archaeology, simply put, is studying people of the past by using the material remains that they have left behind. So things like houses and garbage that they left behind, sometimes even their bodies in the case of burials, but really any sort of material objects that people left behind, archaeologists can dig up and study those things to understand how people lived in the past. Now, here in the United States, as well as much of North America and South America, archaeology is part of the discipline of anthropology, which is just the holistic study of human beings throughout time and across space. So, with archaeology, anthropology includes cultural anthropology that studies living people, linguistic anthropology that studies language and cultures, and then physical or biological anthropology that studies human evolution and our earliest non human ancestors. So, when taken all together, anthropology provides this really broad overview of what it means to be human and how humans interact with each other. If we zoom in on archaeology in particular, archaeology, most of our work is done out in the field at archaeological sites. And these sites can include all sorts of things. So many of you are probably familiar with Stonehenge, these ancient stones in England that appear to have been set up as a calendrical system or other ritual site. So archaeological sites can look like this. They can also look like Lascaux caves in France, where early humans painted animals and other people on the walls of caves. Sites can look like Machu Picchu in Peru, which was an ancient city and residence of one of the Incan rulers. It can, I apologize, it can look like ancient cities like the Great Zimbabwe, found in modern day Zimbabwe in Africa. It can even look like this. So this is Cahokia Mounds here in the United States, which is an ancient, huge, massive city here in the ancient Americas. This is more images from Cahokia and the excavations. I know Ethan can speak to this a little bit more. This is more in his neck of the woods.
Yeah, so this is a famous site. It's kind of associated with this complex, which we refer to as like the Mississippian peoples. But these peoples we've referred more to as like they're interacting heavily with the Mississippian peoples at this time. But it's a very famous site here in Oklahoma called Spiro, and it has one of the more unique earthen mounds in North America. It's a multi-conical mound that has this like encapsulated chamber. It was encapsulated like airtight with clay that like held was intact for like 600 years, and it had like feather macaque cloaks from Mesoamerica. They're present within it, and that kind of stuff. And this kind of it's the argument currently is that it's like a diorama of a way which within which to intervene with the environments, with the cosmological forces, with the deities that be, to hopefully because there's a prolonged multi-generational drought that is happening. But as you can see in the left is that sorry, my dog is jumping in my lap. Like as you can see on the left, this is Craig Mound, which is the mound within which the lodge was built, and it's quite large. As you can see, with the people that are standing on top of it and standing at the base of it. And something that's very important that these people weren't really accounting for at this time was safe excavation practices. And unfortunately, I think two people died during these excavations because they weren't properly shoring up their walls, and landslides happened and collapsed on top of them. But we can go more into that later. But there's something that probably that might be relevant for you guys thinking about ways to make safe, better, more safe excavation practices through things like robotics.
Yeah, so here, even in Oklahoma, where Ethan and I are, there's lots of archaeology, and we find archaeology all over the world. And it'll look different in different parts of the world because people are very diverse and have done things in different ways everywhere throughout all of history. Uh, for example, again, this is another big site. This site is located in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. And this site's called Pueblo Bonito. This is more in the area where I work. I've done lots of work in southeastern Utah. I've also done work on sites like this in Chihuahua, Mexico. So this is a site called Cueva de la Olla, where people were living here in this rock shelter. And you can see in the background, these are houses where people used to live. And this odd structure here in the front was used to store corn for the people who lived here at this site. So archaeology is found everywhere in the world. And as you can see, different archaeological sites all look very different from each other. They all contain lots of different materials. They have to be excavated in different ways. And this can pose challenges for archaeologists who are trying to understand the past and the people of the past in the best way that we can. And we hope to show that throughout this presentation, we think that you guys studying robotics can contribute to solving some of these issues and some of these difficulties that we have. This is another site in northern Mexico where I work. This site is called Paquime. You can see that the rooms look very similar to the other site I was just showing you. But again, we just wanted to highlight the diversity of sites that we find around the world. Now, we want to shift a little bit from what archaeological sites look like to what actual archaeological research looks like, and what different artifacts that we work with look like. So these three pictures are pictures of some of the colleagues that I work with in northern Mexico. And at this site, we were digging what we call a pit house, which is a house that people used to live in where they would dig down into the ground and then plaster the floor and then put posts around the wall to put a thatched roof on top of. And so as you can see, when archaeologists work, we're down in the dirt and we dig these square holes that are usually 1 meter by 1 meter in size. And we dig in those square holes in this way, and we dig in levels so that we can keep track of where all the artifacts that we are digging come from. Because most of what we can learn about an artifact, we learn from its association with other artifacts. So for example, if we were to find a certain ceramic or pottery bowl in a room with a fire pit and animal remains and plant remains, we might assume that that pot was used for cooking and so on. However, if we find that same pot in a room with a bunch of other pots, we might make other conclusions based on the association of other artifacts that we find them with. So it's really important for archaeologists to dig like this in these careful squares and in close, small levels so that we can keep track of where artifacts are coming from. As I say, do you have anything to add here, Ethan, about how archaeologists dig?
Yeah, sorry, I was getting carried away responding to the chat.
Oh, you're good.
But yeah, digging it depend a lot on the climates and like the soil itself, as Sam was talking about. And like for example, like some of the sites like Spiro that we work at the southeastern archaeologists at the University of Oklahoma work at. It's has this lots of weird problems associated with it. One being is because they built a dam nearby in the 40s and the 50s that to like store water, manage water a little bit more effectively. But they had some unintended consequences. One being is that it raised the water table for the entire surrounding area. So Spiro is one of the few places archaeologically where not only do you have to worry about water coming, from above you when it's like raining and that kind of stuff, you have to protect the site that way, but you have to worry about water coming up from underneath, and that can pose a lot of challenges.
Yeah, I was going to say, so these are images that Ethan was just talking about at Spiro Mounds, where again, Ethan can talk to this more, but this was one of the relatively dry days, and you can see that they're digging these square holes again, like we were doing in Mexico. But environmental issues like that, like water tables and weather, can significantly impact the work archaeologists do because these holes can fill up with water. And that water can damage some of the materials that we're looking at.
Yeah, that machine on the left was a magnetic susceptibility reader to kind of try to tell, because like reading the soil is really important in archaeology. It can be really challenging, especially when like there's different moisture levels. So sometimes it helps to have a more like objective aid.
Yeah, and so as you guys can see in these images, archaeologists use lots of tools like trowels and buckets, scoops, This is what we call a screen or a sieve in the background of the right image here. Because as we dig up the dirt, archaeologists have to screen all of it. We have to put it through a sieve to catch any artifacts that are in the dirt. Um, and then as Ethan was talking about, we use lots of high-tech equipment too, to measure different characteristics of the soil, to map our sites, to photograph the site or scan it using 3D technologies like LiDAR or structured light imaging. We can use geophysical methods like magnetometry to see below the ground even before we start digging. So there are lots of different methods that we use, and as you can see, lots of people can get involved with archaeology, whether that's in digging, in analyzing artifacts, or even in communicating the results of what we find to communities that are interested in this archaeology. So now we want to shift and talk about some of the artifacts that we find in archaeology, and I'll let Ethan talk about this. This is some of the stuff he studies.
Yeah, so these are things related to the Calf Creek Horizon, which is what I'm oriented around for my dissertation currently. And it's groups, we're not sure if it's one group of people or some groups of people living in Oklahoma and the surrounding area about 6,000 years ago. And as you can see, they made some very interesting looking stone tools. Like these are very unique. And something it's especially unique about them is like they're just large, as you can see, is one on the far left. They range in size, but some of the larger ones are like gigantic and they're remarkably thin, which means that like they would have broken very easily, would have been very hard to make. And as you can see, sometimes they would be used to hunt bison. As you can see, this one's like lodged in a bison skull. And this is even a bison too. It's not the modern bison. It's a bison Antiquus occidentalis, which is like kind of like the halfway point between like some of the oldest bison and the contemporary bison. And like there's a lot of stuff you can get by analyzing these artifacts and stuff like that. But yeah, as people are talking about in the chat, is something that is vital to making sure you can actually do the analysis you want to do is retrieving these artifacts, like excavating them or just this, like protecting them and getting them into a context within which you can study them. And it's because they are so they're quite large and they're made of rock, so they're not as fragile as other things, but they can still break very, very easily. And something we have to worry about a lot, especially with these things in particular, is because they are so pretty and they're so visually striking, is that they attract the attention of lots of people. And a lot of people, they don't know the like the proper like ethics within which to gauge these things. Like one of the best ways would be, if you notice something like this, is to try to contact an archaeologist within which you can like kind of figure out a plan to go forward from there. There's lots of people, they'll dig up these things, and some people too with not great intent, that which we refer to as looting, and it's a crime technically if you do it on like federal land or if you do it on someone's land that's not your own. And it was something we always try to encourage when we talk, because I work a lot with people we call avocational archaeologists and collectors. And something we always try to encourage is that if they, because they're some of them, they know what they're doing completely. They're very, very skilled at this kind of stuff. Some of the first archaeologists to excavate these kinds of tools, actually, in the 1970s, were avocational archaeologists. However, a lot of people don't, and this can cause a lot of problems and can really limit the kind of information you can get from them.
Yeah, so that contextual information, like Ethan and I are talking about, is some of the most important stuff that archaeologists work with. Um, Moving on, here are some other stone tools that archaeologists might work with. So, like with Ethan, we deal with lots of what we call chipped stone tools, which are made by taking stones and breaking off pieces of them to make sharp objects like arrowheads or blades or knives. But we also frequently work with ground stones, or stones that have been sort of either chiseled into shape or ground into shape by rubbing rocks together to create things like this ancient hoe used for digging um, agricultural fields. We can also find ground stones like this. So these square blocks were used to grind corn into a flour in ancient Mexico. Stone can also be used like these round discs as architectural features. These are foundation stones for pillars at archaeological sites. So there's a wide variety of stone tools that people made and used in the past. And archaeologists have to develop different techniques for analyzing different kinds of stone materials. Archaeologists also frequently work with ceramic artifacts, so pottery. Sometimes we find whole pots, like this is a jar that was found in Mexico, and you can see somebody made it so that it looks like a person. This jar has a face. But mostly what archaeologists find are more like this picture on the right, where we're finding just fragments of pottery. And even just broken pieces of pottery like that can tell us a lot about the past. We can use those broken pieces to determine what kinds of pots people were making. We can even, there are many high-tech sort of techniques to determine where people were getting the clay from to make these pots. And we can use that information to trace how pottery was traded and moved across different regions. I know a common question that we have gotten in the chat and from groups that have emailed us is, how do archaeologists store and transport these materials? When it comes to small materials like ceramic fragments or stone tools, we mostly just put those into little plastic baggies and label them where in the archaeological site it's coming from, so that when we put those in boxes and take them back to the lab, people can know where these artifacts are coming from as they do the various analysis or various analyses that archaeologists do. Now, with something like this picture on the left, a whole pot, something that's delicate, we might wrap that in cotton or bubble wrap or some other material to prevent it from being broken as we transport it. But much like you would pack a box to mail, we're just using soft materials that sort of absorb any sorts of shocks to help prevent these from chipping or shattering or breaking. If we go backwards for a minute to stuff like these ground stone, what we call metates, that are used for grinding corn, sometimes archaeologists will be interested in studying the residues on those artifacts. And so those might be wrapped in tin foil before they're transported to prevent any modern residues from contaminating them before analysis. So to answer that question about transport, it really depends on the types of objects that we're working with and how delicate they are. Because something like this big, heavy stone metate is not very delicate. We don't have to be very careful when transporting it. But if we want to look at something like residues, we want to cover that up in tin foil before we move it so that it doesn't get contaminated. These are just more examples of artifacts that we find. So on the right here, we have a statue that's made out of stone. So somebody carved this statue. Well, on the left, this is a figurine. So again, you can see the face here, made out of the humerus or the upper arm bone of a black bear. So people were even using animal bones to make tools and art and other artifacts throughout history. And we can study these bones to understand why people were making these things, as well as what sorts of animals they were interacting with to make different objects. So that's just sort of a very brief overview of the sorts of materials that archaeologists work with. And there are lots of materials that we didn't talk about, like plants that archaeologists will work with, or textiles, so fabrics that in certain parts of the world archaeologists will study. But how we study those things are all dependent on the type of material being used. Do you have anything to add, Ethan, before we move on to the challenges here?
Nothing particular. Yeah, I think you're doing a great job getting an overview.
Okay. So before this meeting, Ethan and I sat down and we sort of talked about the different challenges that we face in archaeology. And as archaeologists, we face lots of different challenges, and we've sort of grouped them here into two categories. Social challenges, or things that archaeologists face that have to do with how modern people interact with each other and interact with archaeology as a discipline. and then technical challenges. And these are the sorts of things that archaeologists out in the field have to figure out what to do archaeology in the right way. So as far as social challenges goes, vandalism is a really big issue. And this encompasses things like looting that Ethan was talking about earlier, where people will go to archaeological sites and steal items, trying to resell those later. And why that sort of vandalism is really harmful and why it's a challenge is because when you take those artifacts out of their place, they are subject to damage. And we also lose that contextual information or or that information about what artifacts are found together that help us learn from the artifacts. So when these objects are stolen or looted from archaeological sites, it removes our ability to understand what they mean or what they can tell us about people in the past. We also face issues, and we'll show some pictures of this later, where people, particularly at rock art sites, will destroy or write over rock art. And similar to looting, that impedes our ability to learn from it and ruins these really beautiful pieces of art that everyone can enjoy if people would not disturb them. We also face issues of private versus public versus indigenous ownership of archaeological remains. So when an archaeologist excavates a site, who has a right to own and display the objects that we find? Should everyone in the whole world be allowed to access these artifacts to learn from them? Or is it more important for indigenous communities or communities that are descendant from the people we are studying to be able to control their own history and their own cultural heritage? So issues like that can be a big discussion in archaeology of who gets to control these materials, and what should the information we gather from those materials, how should that be distributed? Who can access that information, particularly when it deals with sacred information or culturally sensitive information? Another social issue is when it's appropriate for lots of people to access archaeological sites or materials, how do we encourage people to engage with those materials in a way that is non-destructive? So again, vandalism is an issue, but even at places like Machu Picchu in Peru, there's such a large number of people that want to visit Machu Picchu that as they walk over the site and so on, they're accidentally doing damage. And so there's issues about how can we get people to archaeological sites, because it's important for people to engage with archaeological sites, but how can we do this in a way that doesn't damage the site and prevent further research and further enjoyment by other people? And then lastly, among the social challenges we have are sacred spaces. So many archaeological sites are really important to the religions and cultures of modern people as well as past people. And so it's important that archaeologists think about how we engage with these sites so that we aren't being disrespectful to a variety of cultures and a variety of religious beliefs as we engage with pasts that may not be our own. Do you have anything that you'd like to add here, Ethan, or?
I mean, these are this is a really good list that covers a lot of stuff, because it's like one thing that if you ever become an archaeologist that you realize is that like there's a set there's a list of things you'll think you'll have considered everything. Is effectively what I'm trying to get at. You'll think you'll have considered every possibility, and then something will happen that well, a wrench into the proverbial situation. It could be something as like simple as like there's like a whatever material you're using to cover your unit at the end of the day, it had a hole in it that you weren't aware of, or like an animal decided that it wanted to, because when you cover a hole with a tarp, it actually must be a pretty appetizing home for a lot of animals. But there are when things that can go wrong will. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, that is very true. It seems like every time we try to do something new issues crop up, and that's a good thing. That allows us an opportunity to learn and grow. But moving on from the social challenges, there are some technical challenges that archaeologists face. Ethan discussed earlier flooding. Where he works, the water table is quite high. And so as archaeologists dig into the ground, their holes naturally fill with water. So how do archaeologists deal with that issue? Weathering and erosion can be big problems. In a minute, we'll show you a picture of a site where there were exposed mud brick walls. And it was in an area where it was getting rained on and causing these walls to deteriorate over time. And so archaeologists came up with sort of a creative solution. They just built a roof over the site to prevent that sort of weathering. But that's a very expensive solution that won't necessarily work in lots of places. So how, weathering and erosion affects archaeological sites is a major technological problem that we have. Rockfall or mudslides can also be a big issue. As archaeologists dig, they disturb the environment, and that can cause things like rocks to fall and destroy archaeological sites, or pose a risk to human life as people visit the site or dig at the site. Excavation procedures, so how do we best dig different kinds of artifacts, is another problem. Digging up broken pottery is very different from digging up complete pottery or plant remains, or in some cases, human remains. It's not always appropriate in all places to dig up human bodies, but in other places, that's an important component of archaeological research, is to dig up previous burials and understand the physical bodies of people. So how do we do that respectfully and without damaging bones and ceramics and so on, is an issue that archaeologists face. Another issue we have is how to power some of our tools. So particularly as high-tech tools are introduced into archaeology, we have to figure out how to power them, and not everything runs off of a battery. Some things only have power cords. So how do we power these tools when we're working in remote areas where we don't have easy access to electricity or batteries can be an issue. And then lastly, a technical challenge that we face is accessibility. Archaeologists generally want lots of people to be able to visit and enjoy and learn from archaeological sites. But how do we make it so that people, regardless of their physical capabilities or any mobility aids or so on that they use, how can we make archaeological sites and archaeological information accessible to those people? Do you have anything that you'd like to add, Ethan, or any other thoughts you have?
Yeah, I can talk about accessibility a little bit because that is a big thing. Is that like as Sam has talked about several times, it's there are lots of different people that are interested in archaeology, and it's one thing for it's one matter just for us to be able to go out to a site it's in and like, study it and then bring those materials back for whichever museum or whichever the best way to view them depending on the ethical considerations. However, it's very rare that you can like bring people to the site. And in the times that where that is possible, I think the classic one that illustrates what I'm getting at is like Machu Picchu, where it's a site that's like way up in like the top of a mountain. It's very hard to get to. And there are ways in which you can get to people to these places, but however, it's there's always going to be a fine line between like how much you're able to like how what kind of paths you're able to build and that kind of stuff, and what kinds of because you always have to balance out how many things you have to build that may like, damage the actual archaeology you're trying to get people to these places to come see. And museums too, a lot of the museums are really old and they're not anywhere near as accessible as they should be because they oftentimes don't have access to funds in any way that would actually like a lot of museums are just they need help in lots of ways too. So if there are people that are more interested in like the museum side of things, there's definitely plenty of applications there.
Thank you, Ethan. So just to cap off, we wanted to show you some of the pictures of some of these issues in practice. So like Ethan was talking about, are some of the excavations at Spiro Mounds here in Oklahoma. And you can see that after a day of digging, the holes are full of water. And it is hard for archaeologists, again, to work in water. This can damage archaeological materials. and this is a challenge faced by Ethan and his colleagues at Spiral Mounds. This is an image of a rock art site in southern Utah where, again, you can see someone has intentionally spray painted over this rock art. This particular site is also interesting because despite what it says here, this site is not on private property. It is on publicly owned lands. And so this is a form of vandalism that destroys this site for other people who might be able to come and enjoy it and learn from it. This is another rock art site in Utah where, again, all the red and the blue paint here is modern. That's spray paint, and including this black paint. And this site has been so damaged that you can't even see the archaeological rock art underneath all the spray paint anymore. So this is what vandalism can look like. And again, we talked about some existing solutions. So this is a site in Arizona where, again, this ancient building was being eroded by rain and other weather. And so they just built this giant roof on top of the main part of this site to help protect it from the elements. So this is an interesting sort of engineering solution at this one particular site. However, again, they spent, I don't know how much money, but they spent a lot of money to build this structure at this site. And that's just not an option in many parts of the world. And again, Arizona doesn't get lots of rain, and when it does, it tends to fall straight down. In other parts of the world where you get more rain, a simple roof like this may not be sufficient. You may need more of a structure to protect it. But that's the presentation we have. We would love to answer questions for anybody who has them.
So much for your guys' presentation. This was a lot of really, really good information. And actually, it answered a couple of the questions that I was going to ask you guys to start off. Thank you so much for sharing about the challenges. I know that's one of the things that a lot of the students are looking for, understanding some of the challenges in the field. Um, Before we get started to some of the student questions, which we are currently compiling into a list, and I noticed, Mr. Mofidi, thanks for answering a lot of those questions in the chat. I noticed a lot of that happening as well. Um, I wanted to ask, what are some of the technologies that you guys use during excavation?
I was going to say there are a huge range of technologies that we use. Some of the most common, we use GPS systems. We can use those in mapping purposes, in marking site locations, and in establishing what we call datums. So essentially, we can use a GPS unit to take a very precise point. And then we usually mark that point at the site with rebar or some other permanent feature. And then every measurement we take at the site, we take off of that datum point. And that allows us to, A, find the site again, take very precise measurements at the site. And then also, if future researchers come to excavate again at the site, they can use that same datum and know exactly where we dug, what we dug, and reconstruct what we did as they do their own excavations. Another type of technology that we use frequently is called a total station. And you've probably seen total stations in use if you've ever seen like construction workers building a road or a house. It involves sort of a setup of this machine that has a laser on it. And then a person will carry around sort of a pole with a mirror on top. And what the total station does is it shoots a laser to that mirror and then measures how long it takes to bounce back. And it uses that information to take very precise measurements of distance and depth at the site. In addition to those technologies, we use things like LiDAR and 3D scanners to find sites and to record sites. I talked earlier about geophysical methods that allow us to see under the ground before we start digging. So there's a huge range of technologies that we use. And if there are particular technologies anyone would like to know about, we're happy to talk about those as well. As I said, do you have anything to add to that, Ethan? Any technologies that you think are really important that I missed?
Well, I mean, you talking about the datums reminded me of something that's been a bit of a problem because it's Spyro. This is a problem at other sites too that have been studied for a long time, but Spyro's been studied archaeologically for over 100 years at this point. And so the first people that worked there, their datum, in an ideal scenario, we would all be using the same datum. However, we don't know where that is. And people have tried for a long time trying to figure out where the original datum is. And you can kind of try to backtrack and like reconstruct their thought processes of where and like the way things happen. So maybe you can try to reconstruct that. But also there's things like between then and now, the landowners they decided to build a creek going through the center of the site and that kind of thing. And so there are lots of complications that can get in the way of trying to. It's almost like if you guys have ever worked in like group projects, coming along and like working with other people. Sometimes it can go really well as long as people are communicating and these things are the data is making its way. Everybody's aware of it and making decisions that are something that everybody agrees upon. However, if people are doing their own thing or not doing enough of the work, then it creates some pretty massive problems.
I have another question that I noticed a couple of other people also brought up. Um, how do you preserve artifacts once they are unearthed, and like how do you prevent them from getting damaged or otherwise? I think I've seen several of these questions as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a hard one to answer because every different kind of object requires a different level of care. So for things that are quite durable, like ceramics or ground stone, and even some chipped stone, most of what we do is when we excavate it, we just put it in a plastic Ziploc baggie and then mark that bag with the information about where it came from in the site. So how deep it came from, which hole it came out of, and so on. For more delicate artifacts like whole ceramic vessels or bone or so on, we frequently will need to wrap that up in some sort of soft material. A common one we use where I work is cotton quilting batting, so the like cotton material that they put inside of quilts. It's very soft, it's very cheap, and so we can actually wrap artifacts in that before we put it into a box for transport. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some artifacts will require special treatment. So things like organic materials that we plan to send off for radiocarbon dating, that has to be put into tin foil and wrapped in tin foil to protect it from contamination so it doesn't mess up the analysis. But how we preserve artifacts really depends on what they are. So after we've transported them and they're like at a lab or at a museum, usually most preservation involves keeping them in temperature controlled rooms. So things like refrigerators or air conditioned rooms, and then monitoring the amount of humidity in the room and maintaining the humidity at a certain level so that those artifacts don't become damaged. But again, things like ceramics aren't super sensitive to those things, and so they can be displayed and they can, be stored in less careful conditions. But things like plant remains, wood, um, organic things, those tend to deteriorate, and those we take lots of care to refrigerate and sometimes preserve with chemicals, though I know people frequently try to avoid chemicals when possible just because they can like using chemicals can present health hazards, it can present its own form of damage to these artifacts, but it really just depends on the situation and what objects are being used.
Yeah, and I'll just add too real quick that something that a lot of modern excavations like something that we've kind of talked about here and there is like chemical sourcing kind of analyses, other things like that, compositional analyses, and something that like people used to do back in the day, especially some of the collections that I work with that were gathered in like the 1930s and the 40s, that people would be smoking all the time in archaeological sites and that kind of stuff, and sometimes just being just having people smoking the aerosolized carcinogens, whatever they are, they will compromise your ability to do those kind of chemical sourcing things. Even just people that are smoking, people used to smoke in the museums too, which is insane to me. But things like that can ruin your day.
Yeah, well, and even surprising things. So, where I work in the American Southwest, there's an interesting case where a researcher was trying to identify if people had made chocolate in the past. And so they were taking residues off of old bowls, and they found that essentially everything had chocolate on it. And they're like, that's unusual. We know in the past chocolate was fairly rare and sort of an elite item. So, why are we finding it on so many objects? Well, and it turned out that at the museums, when people would have like a piece of chocolate with their lunch, or they'd bring in cookies with chocolate in it for the museum staff, that residues from modern chocolate was being transferred onto the objects. And so all of this analysis they had done wasn't reliable because we couldn't distinguish if it was modern or ancient chocolate that was being measured. So it can be tricky, those sorts of preservation issues.
That's really interesting. I'm gonna move on to some of the questions from the guests because we have a lot of them today. And I'm hoping we can answer as many as we can for the rest of the time. Um, One of our questions we got was, how do archaeologists put together broken pieces of information or artifact to uncover or understand how or why the artifact was used?
It again, it sort of depends on the context. So sometimes when we find broken pottery, if it's distinctive enough, we're actually able to put the piece of pottery back together and glue it back together. And that can help us learn more about the pots. Most of the time, the way we're reconstructing information is by, again, looking at where objects were found and what other objects were found nearby. We can also count artifacts and different types of artifacts to compare quantities of artifacts at different archaeological sites. And that can provide us with some information as well. So, for example, in the research I do in northern Mexico, I do a lot of this counting of ceramics. So I count up the different types of ceramics we have. So some of them are painted, some of them are painted with multiple colors, while others are not. Some are plain, some are textured, meaning people have scratched designs into the surface. And I'm comparing the amounts of these different kinds of ceramics we have at sites to understand how people were trading goods and organizing themselves based on those artifact counts. So, how we reconstruct this information is a lot of that kind of work where we're trying to figure out where things came from, how many things are found in different places, and what we find together versus what we find apart from each other.
With stone tools too, because something I focus on is more like we call like lithics, and it's refitting can be a really that's what we call refer to it as is like refitting certain things. It's something that's less common with stone tools, and usually only something that can be performed on much older stone tools because they're much larger. Because it's really hard that you can't really it's a tiny little arrow point. You can't really reconstruct all the different flakes that came off of it necessarily. But it can really because it's something that we're really curious about, and it is any kind of material specialty is like reconstructing the decision making that went into these kinds of points and like how people navigated certain challenges and things. So reconstructing those things can also help reconstruct behavior in some ways.
I have another question that we've got a couple of times. How do you know where exactly to dig?
That's a really good question. And like with all the other stuff, we have lots of different methods. So one way we know where to dig is by doing pedestrian survey. So you just line up a bunch of people and walk over a certain area of land looking for indications of archaeological sites, like artifacts on the ground or buildings or that sort of thing. We can also do aerial reconnaissance survey where you use things like drones or planes to fly over an area looking for those like indications of a site. There's interesting research recently coming out of like southern Mexico and Guatemala, where people mounted LiDAR on the bottom of a plane and were able to find whole cities we didn't know existed um, using LiDAR imaging of sites. And sometimes there's just a fair bit of luck that goes into finding an archaeological site. I know one site that I worked at was on a farm, and the farmer one day, as he was plowing, noticed that pieces of pottery were coming up in his plow line. And so he brought those artifacts into the museum that I was working at the time, and said, "Hey, I'm finding this stuff. What is it? Do you guys want to come excavate at this site that I'm finding?" And we were able to go out there and dig at the site just because he happened to turn up archaeological materials while he was plowing his field.
Yeah, those unexpected sites can really something that Lakshay asked in the chat too is that we ever have sites that are buried, and in response to that, like something that I was thinking of when Sam was talking was like something that's called like settlement predictive like models trying to like predict where certain groups of people in the past would have like placed their occupation areas. And one thing that can be a mitigating factor, especially for like the people I'm interested in studying, is that the site system is buried under like 20 feet of like soil has been deposited by rivers. And also too, it's like as much as good as those models can be, which you can make with different kinds of software and stuff, is that people are good at doing things that you cannot really predict. They're really good at being unexpected. One example is that in the period that I'm interested in, it was thought that a lot of the southern plains were almost uninhabitable because there was like so much drought. So there was like no water effectively for a lot of areas. And so someone recently, within the last like 10 or 20 years, they wanted to build a swimming pool in rural West Texas. And when they built the swimming pool, they found one of the more important archaeological sites relevant for my research, and it was really surprising because it's this would have been maybe hundreds of kilometers away from something that would have been a large body of water. And so just to kind of show that people do astounding things like chasing a bison into the middle of a desert for who knows how long.
I was gonna say, as Ethan was talking, I noticed someone in the chat asked about satellite images, and we do sometimes use satellite images to find sites. In fact, there is an archaeologist by the name of Sarah Parkak, where she has actually set up a project and a website where she asks just regular people to log on to the website and take a look at images and look for certain things that might indicate archaeological sites. And so she's been able to gather lots of crowdsourced data to identify areas where we think there might be sites to go and excavate.
There was one question about LiDAR and um GPR,
Mm-hmm.
like what it is and how it works and how it's helpful to the field.
Yeah, so LiDAR and GPR are two different technologies that are used in archaeology. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. And essentially, how it works is it's a machine that has a laser on it, and it shoots the laser out and sort of tracks back and forth across either a site or an area of ground, or you can even use it on individual objects. And the machine is essentially just measuring the speed of that laser as it bounces back and forth between the machine and the object. And it uses that data to create what's called a point cloud. And that's just a cloud of data points that essentially represent the three-dimensional space of an object. So what's really nice about LiDAR for finding archaeological sites is that because of the properties of the laser and because it's sending so many pulses at once, it is actually able to see underneath trees and canopy. So you can actually use software to manipulate that point cloud to remove the canopy and the trees to see what's underneath. And so that's one of the features of LiDAR that has been really attractive in places like Guatemala, where they have dense rainforest and so on, that allows us to sort of see beneath those trees where it's hard to do pedestrian survey and other forms of looking for sites. Ground penetrating radar, or GPR, is another way that we can look for sites and see below ground without digging. And essentially, GPR, you put in sort of a basket that sits on the ground, and then you drag it back and forth across the surface of the site, and it sends an electromagnetic pulse into the ground. Now, as that pulse travels through the ground, it will penetrate in some points, but as densities of soil change or as it interacts with certain objects, parts of that wave will bounce back to the machine. And so the machine measures when and how long it takes different pulses to bounce back. And then software can interpret that data to sort of show you changes in density or objects below the surface. So it doesn't create like a clear picture of what's underground, but it can show you areas where there has been disturbance or where there are changes in density of the soil.
Okay, thank you. One of our next questions, we've had several questions regarding AI and its use in archaeology. Could you guys explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like with lots of fields, AI is still very new to archaeology, and archaeologists are still figuring out ways that it can be useful to archaeologists, as well as ethical and appropriate ways to use artificial intelligence in our research. As far as I'm aware, the most sort of popular ideas for how to use AI in archaeology are in automatic identification of different kinds of artifacts. So for example, like the work I do where I'm looking at different types of ceramics, the idea is that you could just take photos of everything and then let the computer sort them out into different categories. So that's one way it could be used. Other people are examining ways that AI might be used to like write code to analyze artifacts or to do statistical analyses or that sort of thing. What I will say about AI research in archaeology is a big concern archaeologists have with artificial intelligence is hallucinations, right? So if we're relying on it to categorize artifacts for us, how reliable is it? Or is it potentially hallucinating information? And archaeologists are also deeply concerned with sort of the ethical and environmental impacts of AI. We know that AI research requires lots of storage, lots of energy, lots of water, and lots of land. And that the data centers that AI relies on um, disproportionately affects indigenous communities, communities of color, and so on. And oftentimes, these are the communities that archaeologists are working with and trying to help in their own pursuit of understanding their pasts. And so archaeologists don't want to engage in any sort of activity or research that will harm or affect these communities that we're trying to help and trying to work with. So archaeologists are deeply concerned with that sort of issue and trying to figure out what are appropriate applications as well as what are the potential harms or dangers that these methods pose. And then, sorry, one more issue with AI that we are concerned with. We talked about how archaeologists sometimes work with information that is sacred or information that is culturally sensitive. And we want to be careful not to put that information into an AI because once that information is in an AI, anyone can access it and we don't know how it will get used. And that will affect how archaeologists interact with AI moving forward to ensure that we are doing so ethically.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the use of AI in archaeology. I believe one of the questions that I've seen a couple of times is how do you guys deal with thieves and vandalism or other like solving like the social challenges that you guys mentioned earlier?
I mean, that's something I immediately I was just talking about it the other day with someone because there's a site we've been working. I used to work for the Department of Transportation here in Oklahoma, and there was a site that someone had put a road on top of in the 1950s, and so the site needed to. It was a very important site, so we found out much later. Even more recently, did it like we probably needed to excavate this site for to make a long story short. And the excavations of course don't take they take a very long amount of time. They're not something that happens very quickly. And the site is underneath a major highway, so there's no real way to. And there's lots of sensitive information. Like there are also people that were buried there in large quantities, and it's something that you don't want lots of people knowing about in an ideal scenario for a variety of reasons. And something that they did was they set up cameras that were running at 24/7 that based off of like solar power to try to deter people, but that didn't really. But people, if they really want to, they'll try to get in there. And even people that think they're being well-meaning, like there's someone that was like, "Oh, I just wanted to come take a look," and then like we were able to find out who he was because the camera got him. He was like, "Oh, I didn't do anything wrong." It's like, well, technically you trespassed. That's a crime right there. And it's like people they don't even other archaeologists, if you're going onto a different archaeologist site, it's like you don't want to. There are a certain way that things are set up. You don't want to go in and intrude on someone else's thought process and potentially screw something up. And so, and something too about this site in particular is that like it's be subject to erosion pretty poorly, unfortunately. And so just even just walking in some places can really destabilize some of the context. And yeah, so it's like as far as one of the, my opinion, one of the best ways to kind of discourage looting is like through education and just talking to people. Because a lot of people they engage in it because they don't know A, that it is something they shouldn't be doing, and B, the why it's something they shouldn't be doing. And like, I mean, there are some people that like, even if after you have those conversations with them, they're gonna do it anyways, and there's not really a way to navigate that other than getting, in my opinion, lots of eyes on a certain site. Because if people that live there, they know that something exists and they think it's important, they're gonna, they're gonna be much better than most archaeologists who have to pay attention to lots of sites. They'll be able to tell you much quicker if someone is thinking about messing with a certain site, and then like it'll also just kind of counteract the idea in the first place that there will be more people that would want to mess with the site.
Yeah, I agree with Ethan that education is one of the most important things we as archaeologists can do to help people understand what's happening in the past, why it's important, and why it's so important that we not loot or vandalize or destroy sites. Um, and just another example of a way that this issue has been approached that I think is innovative and has been having some positive results. The state of Utah has, through their state historic preservation office, instituted a program that they call the Site Stewardship Program. And essentially, through this program, volunteers can sign up, and when they sign up, they are assigned some archaeological sites that they are asked to go out and visit once a month. And on their visit, they take with them a paper form that they fill out where they, mark off if there are any indications of vandalism or looting, and even sometimes like weathering, like if they've noticed that a river has started eroding a riverbank and is damaging archaeological sites, they'll take note of that as well. And this is all purely based on volunteers, but through the site stewardship program, these volunteers can go out and record this information that's really useful to archaeologists. And it has shown to have sort of a positive impact in the community because it's community members that are getting involved in protecting these sites and recording any damage done to them.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And then I have
Just
one. Go ahead.
just a follow-up question. I think a lot of people are also asking, how is painting over it stealing, and how do they consider like vandalism as stealing?
Yeah, so that is going to vary a little bit by place. So here in the United States, any archaeological sites found on public land, so that's land owned by state governments or the federal government. So these are things like national parks or Bureau of Land Management land, or including like National Forest Service land. Um, because it's owned by the government, that means it's technically owned by everybody in the United States. And it's the job of the government entity that owns the land to protect that stuff, but also to provide access to the public since it is public land. Now, when somebody goes onto an archaeological site that is on this public land and vandalizes it, that takes it away or steals it from everybody else who has an equal right to access and enjoy these materials. So, in that way, it's stealing. Now, in other places, the laws work a little differently. So, where I work in Mexico, based on the laws of Mexico, all archaeological sites and materials are owned by their federal government. So, when you actually take artifacts off of a site or vandalize a site, it's a federal crime to do that in Mexico if you're doing that without permission of the government to do it. So when people do it down in Mexico, like it is explicitly defined as theft and stealing. And again, it's because the reason the laws are set up the way they are in Mexico is to ensure that all of the Mexican people can equally enjoy and learn from these archaeological sites that inform the whole history of the country rather than just one person's interest.
I have a question. Is it possible to check when the chocolates are made?
Like when I was talking about chocolate earlier, in some cases, yes. In other cases, no. It depends on what materials have been preserved. So if we find like the cacao beans that are used to make chocolate, we can date those and figure out when it was made. The case I was talking about where they were just checking residues, there's no way to figure out when those residues were made, just to figure out what they are. So it depends a little bit on what has been preserved.
I have another question in which you were talking about volunteers in Utah, and then basically the what if the volunteer basically like steals something and then they write somebody stole something.
That's a possibility. I don't know that that has ever happened. And what I do know is that so when these site stewards go out and they fill out a report, there are multiple site stewards that are assigned to go out that don't necessarily know each other. And when they turn in these reports, the employees at the State Historic Preservation Office actually goes through them. And if they identify damage that's being done, they might send out a professional archaeologist to examine what's going on and to evaluate how best to stop further damage from going. But in my experience, when I've interacted with these stewards, these are people who care very deeply about protecting archaeological sites. And again, they're outdoorsmen, most of them. They like to go out and hike and do those sorts of things. So they're signing up as a way to get outdoors and to visit sites. And so lots of them are really interested in protecting these things so that they and others can continue to enjoy these archaeological sites.
Something I'll tack on too is that unfortunately, even professional archaeologists are not immune from engaging in those like illicit activities. There's a recent example in the southeastern U.S. where someone a professional archaeologist was caught selling artifacts to people on in various places. And I'm not sure if I have like a hard and fast solution for that kind of thing, but it is definitely a problem. But like there are like mechanisms in place that hope to counteract that. One being is that there is a register of professional archaeologists in which that like because archaeology isn't necessarily like a profession where like the medical field, for example, or you have like a license where if you lose your license, you can't practice medicine anymore. And so archaeology doesn't necessarily work that way, like one-to-one. But we do have this register, and if you are a member of the register, and that's oftentimes a requirement for you to work in certain places, then like they have a way within which to revoke your membership if you violate certain ethical practices.
Awesome. I'm so sorry for all of you guys who are unmuting yourselves. We're trying to get through a lot of these questions. So if you guys have any more questions, please email us and we'll be happy to send them over. And you guys will definitely get your responses back sometime this week. So I have a couple more. I think we have 3 more questions before we end the meeting today. Our next one is storing and retrieving artifacts a big problem, and do artifacts get lost often?
So retrieving them is not a big problem. Archaeologists love to collect stuff. So the collecting part or the retrieving it from the ground is not the hard part. And usually artifacts don't get lost. Again, archaeologists are very careful to mark where they came from, where they're going, all that sort of information. The issue we have here is when we collect all these materials, they have to go somewhere. They have to go to a storage facility, usually at a museum. And the issue is there's so much stuff being collected from archaeological sites that museums are running out of space to store it all. So this storage issue is becoming a big problem because we're collecting more materials than we're able to store. And so recently in archaeology, we've been trying to develop methods of, again, studying archaeological sites that don't involve excavation and don't involve removing more materials from the ground, as well as developing projects that work with existing collections in museums to learn new information without necessarily extracting more materials to add to this sort of storage crisis, as it's been called.
Yeah, that storage crisis is really important for a lot of, because one thing that's important to understand, especially it's the way that we view archaeology presently in like a lot of the US and the rest of North America is kind of like they're like cultural resources. And these resources are finite. It's while archaeology is something that's always just by us being people and living lives, we're always creating more archaeological sites. It's we have a very finite amounts of sites from like periods where like it's like from like 1,000 years ago, for example. There's only so many of those sites that exist, and it's always going to get smaller. And so there's an added impetus to analyze the stuff that we already have because we can only excavate something once. And it's if something either whether it's something you can control or not, if something happens, there's no do-over. And so there's plenty of interesting stuff in the museums. As much as it is can be really challenging, you have to kind of like, again, what I was saying about like group projects is kind of trying to get in someone else's head and figure out how they did something, especially if the group project happened 100 years ago. And like with people too, even some people that weren't trained and some people that were trained or trained in a different way. Even today, there's like things that like something that is innocuous is like you're supposed to like with the where I work, it's you string your 4x4 your four-sided units kind of starting from one corner. In a different part of the world they might string it first from a different corner, and that is something that can have more effects than you'd think.
Okay, we have one more question. This one is, are what would you say were most fun or challenging of your careers? Like the most challenging or fun dig of your careers?
I was going to say, I don't know what the most challenging of my career would be. I did work on one project where we were in a really remote location where, again, we didn't have power or electricity or anything like that. But we were luckily working with a team of engineers as well that developed like a trailer with a solar panel rig on top. And they actually designed it so that the solar panel would track the sun. and store all that energy in a battery that we could use to charge our equipment. So that was one challenge that we faced that we were able to find a solution to, but that was challenging. I think the most fun I've ever dug is in northern Mexico. We were digging a cool site with lots of houses, and we were just finding lots of whole pots and jewelry and stuff that was sort of unique and that I haven't ever experienced elsewhere.
The one that came to my mind first was probably the experience that probably told me that I was like, oh, I want to do archaeology as a profession. It was we were doing some field work in eastern Indonesia, and we were like island hopping, going to these different islands, like surveying them and stuff for trying to understand migrations to those islands. And these islands they're kind of like the large bunches of coral that have been like sitting above the water for a long time, and so they're can be quite steep to try to get up, and also they're quite sharp because coral, when it goes through those processes, it becomes quite sharp. And so we had lots of logistical challenges getting to different places. And one of my advisors had a drone that he would use to kind of fly around, get to places we couldn't. But the drone it would run out of battery, and then like if it run, this was in like 2019, so drone technology has gotten a little bit better, but it would just have lots of problems. There was just something to like the stuff with the elements; it would affect the drone, and but like drones can be really useful in those kind of situations. And what Sam was talking about earlier too, with like flying over through other areas like the Amazon, that are difficult to survey by walking, and yeah, those would be some of the ways maybe you can make archaeology a little safer, getting into those more hard to reach places.
Those are both really interesting. Thank you guys for sharing. We have one last question before we end off. I know we're running out of time here. Which are the top 3 problems you guys would like you want solved to help with your day-to-day job? I think this is like one of the big things that the students are looking for their innovation project. So just having an understanding of what are some of the biggest things that you guys have challenges with? I know you guys mentioned several earlier.
Let's see, on the day-to-day level, it's really important that archaeologists work with, again, descendant communities and local communities to ensure that we're, working ethically, and that our research actually benefits real people. So I think something that would be good are technologies that make archaeological research more accessible to more people so that we can communicate what we're finding to a general public as well as to the communities that we're working with. And so that more people can learn from the past and can enjoy the amazing sort of archaeological materials that we find all over the world.
Yeah, if I had to give like 3 things, I'd say yeah, the accessibility is a big one in that regard. And maybe like social media or something like that could be a way of dealing with that. You have to be very careful about what kind of information gets portrayed in what ways and in what platforms. And another would be kind of related to like data management is something we talked about, is that so you get all this data. When you're gathering the data, sometimes they have the easiest part. Figuring out a way within which to view it kind of comprehensively can be really, really challenging, because a lot of like there's like a saying is that like even though that like a lot, so we spend so much time in the field, it's like 80% of the actual analysis happens like in a lab somewhere. And yeah, some things that people talked about were like 3D scanners in the chat and that kind of thing, 3D printers, and something that's very becoming much more common in archaeology, and it's getting rapidly getting better with each coming year, is what we call photogrammetry. And it's something we can use to it's pretty similar, kind of almost like synonymous with like the 3D scanning and printing, that enables like just us to be able to kind of analyze these artifacts in more depth and in much more like you can like, oh, if you scan this artifact this many times and then you're able to create a good model out of it, you can like send it to your colleague across the world in like Australia or something, and they can look at it within like a couple seconds or whatever long it takes the file to get sent across the Pacific. And it's like things like that I think are going to really supercharge what you're going to be able to do with archaeology in the coming decades. And the third thing, yeah, it's like something people, I'll touch on something that people are talking about relating to like transporting and kind of like moving artifacts in that way. And something I think in the email question that I responded to this morning was about like different ways within which to like screen artifacts and then also get them back to repositories. It is like ways that because a lot of the ways that we deal with that, at least in my experience personally, is like very like whatever's on hand, and in the sense that like there's like because there are very few like purpose built kind of tools in archaeology. It's like a classic one is that we use old like prescription pill bottles to store really fragile like projectile points and that kind of stuff. Because it's like you get them from your prescriptions, and then like there are a few other uses for them, and then there are a few all better things that can do that job. So if there maybe are ways to within which to have like like cheap to make but like easily protecting kind of packaging could be useful, and then like things ways within which to screen artifacts and kind of like cut down on the amount of time you have to spend screening and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I know we've, as we've received some emails with questions from people, that storage issue has been a very common question. And I think that's an area where there's lots of good potential solutions for how to store, how to preserve, that robotics and engineering can provide lots of solutions for, as we figure out how to address the storage crisis and how to protect artifacts.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This was a lot of really good information. And I'm hoping that it's helpful for all of the teams and students here joining us today. We have students from all over the US, Romania, Morocco, and Mexico. So this was an incredible opportunity for them. So thank you so much for joining. I know for all of you guys who are joining the meeting today, we didn't get an opportunity to answer all of the questions in the chat, but we will be having an email sent out with more information. And if you ever need to look back on any of the information that we talked about today, we will be posting this as a YouTube video on our YouTube page. So if you have any interest or you need to look back on some of the information talked about today, feel free to visit the website. We also will be having more information meetings and expert series going on throughout this season. So for all of you attendees here today, please take a look at, keep an eye out for that, and we'll have many more opportunities for more information. Before we end off the meeting, could we please get a group photo? So if any of you guys, or if all of you guys could turn on cameras if you're willing, that would be amazing, and we can have a group photo before we end the meeting today. Okay. Awesome. This might take a while because we have a lot of pages of students today.
And while we're waiting, I just wanted to say thank you to you. Thanks for having us, and we're happy to answer questions like this too.
Yeah, we're excited that you guys are learning about archaeology and thinking of creative solutions to archaeological problems.
Okay, so we're gonna start off with the photo in 3, 2, 1. And the next page, 3, 2, 1. Awesome. And one more. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Okay, thank you all for joining. Um, sorry, I lost track of my Zoom for a second. Would you guys like to do a quick summary of information, or would you be willing to do a quick summary of all of the information you guys talked about today before we end off?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So we talked about what archaeological sites look like, what materials and methods archaeologists use, and then we tried to answer lots of your guys' questions about how artifacts are stored, excavated, and analyzed. Again, sort of a big takeaway that we want you guys to have is that it's really important for archaeologists to consider our impact on modern living communities and to work with them to produce knowledge that is beneficial to those communities. It's also some of the challenges that archaeologists face are related to how we store, preserve, and excavate artifacts. But one of the challenges we have is the things we work with are so diverse that each individual object and each individual case needs its own solutions.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Well, I
Yeah, go
suppose
ahead. Go.
yeah, just to very briefly touch, it's like everything, yeah, it's very particular, as Sam was saying. Everything in a context is the most important thing in archaeology as far as like figuring out what happened. And yeah, kind of being very, very patient and cautious is usually some of the best ways to approach situations.
Thank you both so much for taking time out of your weekend and joining us for this meeting. And to all the attendees as well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this meeting was really helpful for all of you guys. Like I mentioned before, if you guys have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to our email and we can help reach out to our experts with us today. And yeah, I hope to see all of you guys in future meetings as well. Thank you all so much for joining. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.